I tell this now at 48. But the memory of being 11 sits in me like a splinter, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. My name is Liang Yu. Back then, I measured the world in coins, the clink of copper against my palm, the tiny islands of change I balanced on the oily rim of a tin cup. I pushed a cart of recyclables before school, each wheel whining like a tired animal, because my mother, Shen Lian, never found steady work after the fire. Our room behind the market smelled of damp cloth and frying oil. The plaster still bore the ghost of smoke. I told myself it was enough. It wasn't. That night the city was humid and restless. The market lights bled into neon, and I was hurrying, whispering to the coins under my breath so I wouldn't feel how heavy my shoulders were. The cart clipped a curb and tipped. Cans scattered across the polished marble of the hotel lobby, 1,000 dull suns bouncing across red carpet. I heard the guard before I saw him. Leather boots, a perfume that said money, not mercy. He spat the words like a verdict. Walking trash. 2 other guards laughed, a sound like snapping twigs. My hands moved on their own, scrambling for the cans, for the one envelope that had slid from a suited man. A thin paper stamped in red, a name I could read even with the shock in my chest. Jianhong. Demon CEO, the newspapers called him. My mother's pendant, an old Liu family emblem she'd kept hidden, warm against her collarbone, came loose when she coughed and collapsed, smoke making her small body tremble. It hit the carpet and tumbled like a fallen coin. The suited man looked down. For a fractured second his face emptied. The air between us went cold. He stared at that pendant as if he'd been struck, as if the past had reached out and slapped him awake. Around us the lobby hushed into a million small conspiracies. A woman's voice, soft, clinical, muttered something about records and Dr. Chiao Wen's insistence that we didn't belong in this story. Whispers braided into accusation before anyone could explain. I felt hands close, not gentle but decisive. The envelope crinkled in my fist, proof and danger all at once. What happened next would not be mercy or luck. It would be a choice that changed 2 lives. Tell me, what pain are you carrying today? If this reaches you, please leave a like, comment your thought, and join me to hear what happened next. The night after the cart tumbled felt like a slow-motion breaking. Red carpet fibers clung to my palms. Crushed cans rolled like tiny moons under the chandelier light. The guard's shoes sounded like verdicts as they surrounded us. Walking trash, one spat, voice flat as concrete. My mother coughed. Smoke had hollowed her voice, and the pendant slipped from her neck, a small brass Liu emblem that hit the carpet and skidded beneath a velvet rope. The suited man bent. The room inhaled, and for a single breath the hotel stopped being a hotel. It became a courtroom. He looked at us then, Liu Jianhong, eyes cold and measuring, as if the sight of a child and a ruined woman were an anomaly in his orderly life. Guilt or shock, I couldn't name it. In that pause Chiao Wen, the hospital's liaison who visited with a practiced sympathy, leaned close to a manager and hissed, "This can't complicate the family files. We lock it down." Her smile was a scalpel. I heard the whisper as clearly as a slap. We were let out under promises that those promises would be kept. A warm blanket, a hospital bed, a chance to talk. Instead, we found white corridors that smelled of antiseptic and secrets. Chiao Wen's clinic was a theater of kindness with its stage directions already written. Nurses I later learned owed favors to men who wore expensive watches adjusted doses with the gentleness of a lie. A little more sedation, one murmured to a vial, and the label on the chart shifted later. Burns, no more. Files were edited by hands that typed like they were erasing histories, not writing remedies. I clung to the envelope, Liu Jianhong stamped in authoritarian red, as if it were a heartbeat. They tried to take it. A man in a plain suit reached for my wrist. His grip smelled of ink and money. "This isn't your business," he said, as if my life were an errand. I felt small as a coin, pocketed and worth less when counted by people who thought the world should be tidy. They moved me toward a van, words muffled by the motor's growl. My mother, drifting in and out of sleep, could only whisper, "Tell them who we are," before coughing into silence. In the doorway, Jianhong watched. Something passed over his face. Fury, disbelief, a calculation, and it stopped my feet. He did not reach for me. He did not call anyone back. But his eyes did not look away. What choice waits behind such a look? If this moment has touched you, like it gently, and follow to see how one cold decision would unravel both our lives. The guards closed around me like a tide, cold hands on my shoulders, the hotel's chandelier turning into a halo of accusation above our scattered cans. I remember the way my knees trembled when one of them spat, "This is where trash belongs," and how the envelope, that bright red stamp with the name Jianhong, slipped from my damp fingers. "Give it here, kid," a voice barked. I heard my mother's cough from somewhere behind, small and broken, and I tried to tell them, "That's my mother's," but words are heavy when your lungs are full of smoke. They marched us into a sterile room that smelled of antiseptic and old paper. A woman in a white coat, Dr. Wen, leaned over Shen Lian as if she were inspecting a case file rather than a human being. "We need to run tests," she said, the kind of sentence that erases lives. Paperwork arrived like vultures, forms to sign, statements to be made, names whispered that didn't include mercy. The nurses glanced at the pendant caught in my mother's blouse, and then at me with the kind of suspicion that makes a child small. "Records?" I asked once, voice thin. Someone shrugged and said, "Lost," as if loss could be programmed into a hospital computer. Then he entered, Jianhong, the demon the city called, movement precise, suit like armor. He looked at the pendant and then at me. For a moment his face was a map of something old and private. "Who gave you that?" he asked more softly than the rest of them, and that softness fell like a hand over my cheek. Around us the world kept making noise, whispers about faked injury, vulnerable family, a liability. Wen leaned close to Lu and murmured, "It would be better for all if they were moved elsewhere." Her smile was a contract. I remember the corridor lights turning long and severe, the way my cards were still stuck in my palm. Then, improbably, Lu stepped between the guards and me. "He's not to be removed," he said. Not a proclamation, a decision. People shifted, stunned. Shen Lian opened her eyes and found his face instead of more hands. "Who are you?" she croaked. He did not answer with words. He reached for the little emblem we had guarded like a secret and turned it in his fingers as if reading a sentence meant only for him. Outside, the city kept humming its indifferent song. Inside, something irrevocable had begun. What pain do you carry that could change someone else forever? If this touched you, tell me below, and if you want to keep walking this path with us, subscribe to hear what comes next. They came for us like a winter wind, polite hands with legal pads, a nurse with too bright makeup, Wen with a voice that smelled of certainty and bleach. "For the child's safety," she said, as if safety could be stamped into a life that had already been burned. They lined the corridors with questions, with forms that folded over themselves like knives. My mother lay hollow in a hospital bed, her lungs pleading beneath the machines. I counted the coins in my pocket until my fingers cramped. I remember the way the fluorescent lights hummed above us, indifferent. The hotel lobby had been a theater, the aftermath a courtroom without justice. Guards murmured about trespassing. Reporters leaned on heels like vultures. Someone photographed the pendant that had fallen from my mother's neck, the Lu crest, the proof of a name that wasn't mine by anyone's kindness. Wen's whisper traveled faster than any fact. Records erased, medication schedules altered, a file that disappeared into the city's bureaucracy. They arranged to take me. "We can place him where he'll be safe," they said, as if safety meant erasure. Then Jianhong stepped forward. His suit was cut like armor. His eyes were cold pool water. I expected scorn. Instead, he frowned at the pendant, and for the first time I saw something like a memory cross his face. Outside, rain bead bled down the hotel glass. Inside, his voice cut through the room. "No," he said, simply. "You will not take him." Wen's smile went small and sharp. "Mr. Lu, it will complicate matters." "It will," he agreed. "I accept the complication." There was a hush, not respect, not yet, but a new danger to the people who had built their case on convenient amnesia. He moved with the economy of a man who calculated risk and found a number that still allowed him to sleep. He signed paperwork and made phone calls that unclenched hospital doors. He paid for medicines with faces that had once been invisible to him. He sat at my mother's bedside with a stiffness that softened in the edges, watching her chest rise. "I don't know how to be a father," he said one night, sitting on a plastic chair while I held my mother's hand. "But I know how to protect." I wanted to believe him, and I wanted to run. People in the market began to whisper, some in pity, some in hope. The city watched. The boardroom murmurs grew into small storms. Xiaowen didn't give up. She filed a complaint, spoke to cameras about protocol, and we were thrust into a legal tangle of power and memory. Yet in the middle of that bureaucratic war, a cold man began to warm. Not with speeches, but with daily, small betrayals of his old self. Showing up, asking questions about childhood, learning the name my mother had given me. What would you do if fate put you in front of a choice that cost your reputation but saved a life? If this touched you, leave a like and tell me your greatest pain below. Subscribe quietly. There are more truths to be unearthed, and the next part will show how the past fights back when a family decides to claim it. He signed the papers in a room that smelled of polished oak and old money, his pen moving with the same precise, unhurried rhythm he used in board meetings. "His name will be on company records as my son," Lu Jianhong said without looking up. His voice was flat, like glass. Around us the hotel lights hummed through the curtains. Outside, the city kept its indifferent roar. My mother's hands trembled as she clutched the pendant, as if it could stitch together the smoke and the lost years, and I kept my eyes on the table, counting the small breaths between heartbeats. They let us stay, but nothing about that mercy was clean. Whispered conversations lodged in the hallways like splinters. Who would accept a scavenger boy as heir to a fortune? Xiaowen walked the corridors with a smile thin as paper, telling anyone who would listen that this was a scandal engineered to cover a mistake. "Records are gone," she said to a security captain, tapping an index finger against a file. "Medicine inventories altered. You don't just vanish a child and not leave fingerprints." At school, I learned 2 languages at once: algebra and how to keep my eyes from betraying where I'd come from. In the dining room of the Liu compound, the plates clinked like obstacles I wasn't allowed to trip on. The other children watched me with the cool curiosity of those who've never had to steal heat from a radiator. Some made fun of how I still counted coins in my pocket, like a talisman. The servants whispered that Mr. Liu was risking everything to protect a secret that might ruin their reputations and sometimes their lives. But in the quiet hours, the steel softened. Once, after a long day of interrogations and lawyers, he found me on the balcony watching the rain smear the skyline into charcoal. He didn't say the words, "I'm sorry." He didn't need to. He handed me a paper boat, folded with clumsy fingers, and said, "Stay." It felt like an order and like shelter. My heart learned a new rhythm then, gratitude braided with fear. Meanwhile, Shen Lian fought to walk without coughing smoke into the night, while Liu sent investigators through hospital corridors to unearth erased files. The first victory was small and bureaucratic, a ledger found in a locked drawer, but its discovery pushed shadows into motion. Xiaowen tightened her smile. The board met in whispers. The city smelled of rain and possibility. What would you have done if someone cold enough to command a city reached for you? If this moved you, stay with me. There's more to what he risked, and how justice starts as a single stubborn truth. The first weeks in Liu Jianhong's house felt like stepping into a photograph of a life I had only ever glimpsed in magazines left by the recycling pile. Gleaming surfaces, hushed footsteps, the hum of an elevator that smelled faintly of citrus and authority. I learned quickly how to fold napkins the way servants did, and how to walk past marble columns without leaving the echo of my old shoes. At night, I would press my forehead to the cold pane and trace the city lights with the same fingers that used to count coins. The pendant, tucked beneath my shirt, pulsed like a secret hearth against my skin. Liu Jianhong watched everything with the same precision he used to steer board meetings. Once, as rain sketched veins on the windows, he sat across the small tea table in the study and said, "You look at things differently." His voice was as flat as ice, but that night it carried a tremor. "Tell me everything that matters." I told him about the market, about how my mother would hum into her bandages to keep the room from feeling like a cave. He listened. He did not smile. He did not promise to fix the world. Still, he taught me how to speak when men in suits asked questions, and how to keep my hands from shaking when a courtroom camera found me. Outside those walls, the whispers sharpened. Xiaowen moved like a slow poison, patient, precise, smiling as she rewrote prescriptions and shifted hospital files into corners where memory couldn't reach them. Once I caught her in the corridor, her face a practiced mask. She said, "People like you make stories complicated." The accusation hung in the air, a verdict before a trial. I felt smaller than the hole in my cart where coins used to fall. At home, Shen Lian's breathing improved in fits and starts. She would grip my sleeve and ask for the pendant. I would slide it between her fingers and watch the way her eyes swallowed the light. Jianhong would stand in the doorway with his hands behind his back, a statue softening at the edges. There were moments. A bowl of porridge passed across a crowded dining room, a hand resting on my shoulder while photographs of other men lined the wall, that felt like mercy disguised as obligation. I was learning to be a son with a name that belonged to other people, and a witness with a truth dangerous enough to undo lives. Xiaowen's network was broader than we imagined, and evidence can be erased as easily as footprints in the rain. What happens when the people who should protect you are the ones who decide you must disappear? If this touches you, like and tell me in the comments. Would you risk everything to be found? Subscribe to follow the next turn, the slow, messy work of taking what was stolen back. I remember the first morning after he signed the papers as if it were a stage cue. The marble lobby smelled of lemon polish and expensive fear. Men in suits pretended not to stare as I passed with my card. Only now the paper cups were pressed into a school bag that fit my shoulders too big, and the cart was wheeled away to the servants' quarters. Jianhong walked beside me and said, not unkindly, "You will learn to sleep without listening for sirens." I wanted to ask how to sleep without hearing my mother's cough, but the words lodged behind my teeth. Home was no longer the damp room behind the market. It was a flat with glass windows that showed the city like a painting. Shen Lian's hands trembled when she touched the Lu emblem that hung around her neck again. "It's heavy," she whispered, and I thought she meant the pendant, the secret, or the truth that had fallen into a hotel lobby and changed the shape of our lives. There were tests, not the kind with gold stars, but ones that measured appetite and patience. The board meetings smelled of cigar smoke and calculation. Lu endured the thin smiles and whispered phone calls. Once, a director said, "A boy like him will stain our name," and Lu's face went as hard as cut glass. He answered not with heat but with paper, transfers for therapy, a lawyer who smelled of tobacco and late nights, a private school where I learned to hide my hands even while they counted coins into a savings jar. At school I learned new rules. A boy named Ming shoved me into a locker later and sneered, "Trash don't belong anywhere but the street," and the locker smelled like the market. I remember wanting Lu to appear like a hero from the novels, to pull me out and say, "Not my son." Instead, he waited by the principal's office, fingers steepled, and when he spoke it was quieter than I expected. "We will stand for what is right." That steadiness, more than a shout, taught me what courage could be. But the shadows followed. Xiaowen's voice came into rooms like a chill, doctored files, missing clinic notes, a nurse whose eyes darted like she'd swallowed fear. There were nights when Shen Lian woke coughing and I hovered by the door, listening to Lu on the phone in a voice that carried both anger and calculation. "They will try to erase what we have," he told someone. "We will not let them." And so the slow work began, tracing ink, chasing signatures, sitting through hearings that smelled of paper and cold coffee. I learned, at 11, that justice is not a single blow but a long patient pulling. You feel each tug in your chest. Tell me, when faced with a choice that could save you but hurt others, what would you do? If you want to keep walking with me through what came next, like, and subscribe. There is a moment coming that will force us all to choose. The first weeks after he chose us felt like waking into a world built for other people. Jianhong moved through his glass towers with the same economy of motion he had used in boardrooms. A hand on the elevator button, a single nod to an assistant, the iron gait of someone used to decisions being obeyed. Yet when he walked into the cramped room behind the market, the marble lost its edge and he simply stood there, awkward as a man without a script. My mother's breathing was thin, like paper in a wind. He sat on the only chair and, without fanfare, placed a heavy envelope on his knee. "We will fix this," he said, and the words sounded like a promise arranged in stone. Fixing it was nothing like the novels I imagined. It was late nights in hospitals where the antiseptic stung and a nurse would flick her eyes away. It was stacks of files that refused to line up with the truth. Xiaowen smiled like a clean thing and then became the opposite. A smear of rationales to hide malpractice, tampered meds, shifted timestamps, a ledger with a missing line. Once I saw a doctor from that night in the hospital corridor, and he turned his face as if he didn't know me. Jianhong did not let him look away. He brought lawyers and old friends who owed him favors, and still the system folded in slow, cold ways. Paper can be rewritten, memory can be blackmailed. Between the strategy rooms and court filings, small tender things stitched us together. He learned how to braid my hair clumsily, as if braiding was another negotiable contract. He bought back my cart of recyclables and parked it by the service entrance like a relic, where I touched it when the world felt sharp. At night he would open his safe and take out the Liu pendant, not to claim it, but to place it in my palm. Heavy, stamped, unbelievable. Shen Lian wept when she touched it. The sound broke something inside both of them. People called him the demon CEO in the papers, and in the quiet of his office he sometimes let that name sit like an accusation he could not scrub off. "You did the right thing," my mother told him once. He didn't answer, only looked at me as if measuring what fatherhood would cost him. "What would you have done if your only proof meant bringing ruin on a man who could crush you, or letting the truth die with you?" If you want to hear how the next battle unfolded, and how a single ledger line nearly changed everything, stay with me and subscribe to follow the rest of this story. They put me in a small interview room first, fluorescent light buzzing like a hive, while whispers vibrated through the marble bones of the hotel. Outside, the world wrote its own verdict. "Walking trash," the guards muttered. A journalist called the lobby a battlefield of class. Inside, a suited man with a face like winter, Jianhong, sat across from me and did something I still can't name. He looked at the pendant in my palm as if it were a mirror. For a long, embarrassing minute, I waited for contempt. He did not give it. "Where does it come from?" he asked softly, and his voice carried the hush of a man trying on tenderness for the first time. "From my mother," I said. "Shen Lian." My sentence choked. Memories of smoke, the market's wet odor, and a tiny room that smelled of mold and rice filled me. He reached out, not to touch the filigree, but to steady my trembling fingers. It felt like an accusation and a lifeline all at once. Once the hotel doors closed on that night, the war of whispers escalated into dossiers and slam-locked drawers. Xiaowen, the doctor who had once been a neighbor in our market's shadow, resurfaced with a practiced needle of malice. He altered charts, muddied paper trails, tried to make my mother a patient without a past. "Best for everyone," he told an investigator with a rehearsed smile, but his eyes were thin with greed. He had erased medications, shifted files, attempted to smother the one proof that could wake the Liu name. Jianhong moved like a man making a choice whose consequences he had already counted. He summoned lawyers, yes, but he also moved through the hospital halls with the kind of urgency money could not buy. Kneeling at my mother's bedside, holding her hand while the monitors clicked like a scared clock. "I will not let them take him," he said to me once, voice low enough that the guards at the door could not overhear the cracking armor. He risked his reputation, his boardroom's quiet judgments. He signed statements where his signature trembled, and he confronted Xiao when in a place where the doctor could not smile away his culpability. Why? I asked him that night as rain stitched the city's neon into a wet mosaic. He looked at me as if telling the truth were the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. Because some debts aren't about money, he said. They're about what you don't know you owe until someone hands you proof of what you were wrong about. The media roared louder. The boardroom whispered revenge. And somewhere between the antiseptic of the hospital and the stained carpets of the market, a slow, grinding machine called justice began to turn. Not cleanly, not quickly, but inexorably. I learned then that acceptance could be negotiated and fought for, and that becoming someone's son could cost a man everything he had built. Have you ever watched a person dismantle himself for someone else? If you want to know what we paid for that choice, the losses and the small mercies, stay with me. I remember the way the marble swallowed my footsteps the first night I walked into Jianhong's life properly, not as the kid with a cart, but as something that could be polished and displayed. He did not take me in like a savior from a fairy tale. He arrived like winter, precise, measured, and impossibly cold. When the lawyers argued about guardianship and the cameras focused on the pendant that had once belonged to my grandmother, he signed papers with the same calm that built an empire. He is yours now, he told the assembled faces, and there was no flourish in that sentence, only a decision that rearranged the axis of my world. At home, in the damp room behind the market, my mother watched the scene as if through smoked glass. Shen Lian's hands trembled more from the memory of smoke than from the idea of riches. She gripped the pendant until the metal bit into her skin and said, "I don't want charity." Her voice was iron-wrapped in fear. The hotel lawyers offered me care, schooling, safety. She offered me stories of a life I could never unlearn. The tug between what I needed and what she feared became a private war inside my ribs. Jianhong acted in ways that did not fit the caricature the tabloids printed. He escorted us to a flat near the hospital and refused interviews. Once, standing by the window while rain drew thin paths down the glass, he asked me something I had never heard from a stranger. "What is your name, really?" I wanted to answer with the small, guarded boy who knew how to count coins. Instead, I said, "Liang Yu." He repeated it once, as if committing it to a ledger, and then walked away to a stack of files whose edges were as sharp as his jaw. Outside the walls, the war of whispers grew teeth. Xiaowen circulated rumors that the fire had been arson to cover malpractice, that records had been altered to protect a powerful family. The hospital archivist, frightened and small, handed me a manila envelope one night and said, "There is a tape." My hands found the cassette like one might find a pulse. We played it in a room that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. A nurse's voice, raw with guilt, named dates and prescriptions that didn't match the charts. Evidence, at last, not just a pendant. Liu confronted the hospital board the next day with the kind of quiet fury that makes men who think themselves untouchable shift in their seats. He moved not with spectacle, but with method, subpoenas, private investigators, late-night conversations in rooms where money is supposed to solve everything and instead met stubborn truth. Watching him there, I felt something inside me loosen and tighten at the same time, gratitude tangled with shame. I was a boy pulled from ruin into a map I did not understand. He was a man whose life would fracture if the truth came out. When the first court date was set, the city turned its face toward us like a storm. I stood beside my mother and the man who had decided to carry the weight of being called my father. I thought about the night my cart toppled, the smell of smoke, the look in his eyes when he saw the pendant. "Are you ready?" he asked me in the hallway before we walked into the courthouse. And it was the first time his voice sounded less like winter and more like someone asking permission to remain human. I nodded, though my stomach was a knotted rope. What would it cost him? What would it cost us? If you had to choose between safety and the truth, which would you choose? And if you want to follow what happened next, stay with me. There was still so much to be uncovered. The city remembers us in two languages, the polite hum of marble lobbies and the wet slap of alleyway roofs. I remember it as weather and taste, the metallic tang of coins, the burned sweetness of my mother's hair, the sterile chill of hospital corridors where people in blue scrubs spoke in clipped sentences that never landed. After that night, After the pendant slipped free and the suited man's face went pale, the world rearranged itself. Accusations came first like sharp weather. Xiaowen, with her soft voice and sharp eyes, whispering about falsified charts and unstable witnesses. Men in gray suits who moved files as if erasing breath. A night when I was taken, swift hands, and a paper bag, and the envelope with Lu Jianhong's name folded like an accusation against my ribs. Then the colder weather broke. He didn't do it for spectacle. Lu Jianhong walked into the rooms I was pushed from and made them open. He called meetings where men argued and left in silence. He paid for records to be re-examined, surprised forensic teams to give time and careful light to a trace of smoke that proved my mother hadn't been lying. He stood in courtrooms that smelled of old paper and waited while lawyers peeled back years of convenient absences. When the city's gossipers hissed, "Demon CEO," he let them. He learned to hold my small hand in public like learning a new language, awkward at first, fingers tightening and loosening, as if practicing gentleness. We did ordinary things in impossible places. He taught me to tie a tie on a kitchen table that still smelled of oil, not leather. I taught him how to carry a cart without fearing the shame in people's eyes. There were nights when he sat at the edge of my bed, a man who could command a company but could not stitch the edges of my nightmares, and admitted, quietly, that he had been frightened to lose his own name if he claimed me. There were days when Xiaowen's shadow returned, an expert witness with misplaced charts, a whisper campaign, and we had to fight again, not just with money but with patience and proof. It was slow, sometimes cruel, the work of justice and of becoming a family. Interviews, tempering of evidence, moments of tenderness filed away beneath depositions. We were not rescued, we were reclaimed. And yet the hardest door was still closed, the one that would let the whole city see what the records, the pendant, and my mother's scars had always said. Would the next day finally open it? If this part of the story touches something in you, tell me below and stay with me. What happened next changed everything. The days that followed felt like an experiment in two halves, the city at its glittering worst, and our small, worn truth smuggled into rooms that had never known grief. Lu Jianhong moved like a man rearranging an entire life on a single chessboard. In his office, the glass walls drank in the river of neon and left him a silhouette that, when he thought no one watched, trembled with a weight I had never given him credit for. He ordered investigations, lawyers, quiet transfers of money that would pay for things I could no longer imagine paying for. Clean air in a hospital room, food that did not taste of rust, school books that did not fall apart. "Do you remember your name?" he asked me one late night, his voice stripped of headlines. I could hear the city breathe below us. I said it like a prayer, "Liang Yu," and he closed his eyes as if he needed the sound to prove what the pendant already had. Shen Lian sat at the edge of his leather couch, fingers still singed, the Lu emblem heavy on her throat like a verdict. But power invites resistance. At board meetings, Lu Jianhong was no longer merely a strategist. He became a scandal. Men who had shared whiskey and spreadsheets with him now spoke of reputation, as if a child could be an infection. Xiaowen moved like a shadow through corridors where the sick slept, whispering about fake records, misplaced prescriptions, and inconvenient truth best erased. "We don't need ghosts," she snapped to one nurse, and there were eyes that quickly looked away. Liang and me was a small, quick thing. I learned to keep my hands clean, to fold my voice into corners where it could not be picked apart. Schoolmates saw the suit and assumed slick certainty. The girl who sold sticky buns in the alley still bowed her head in the doorway. My mother laughed sometimes, a small, surprised sound, when the lights warmed our rented room for the first time. Other nights, she woke gasping, as if smoke still lived in her lungs. One evening, a smear piece appeared on the front page, a photograph of my bent cart beside the hotel's red carpet, a headline calling me theft by association. Lu Jianhong held the paper until it softened. "They will try to buy silence," he said. "We will pay with truth." He was not soft because the world had demanded it. He was soft because the cost of not being my father had finally been counted. If this moment touches you, if you feel the tug between sacrifice and shame, Give it a like. Tell me below what you would do in his place, and stay with me. What happens next will decide whether a name is reclaimed or buried forever. I tell you this as a man with more years than courage now, remembering how new the world felt when a stranger decided my fate. After the lobby incident, the hotel lights seemed to pulse like a spotlight on shame. They put me in a small room at the Liu estate. Not a prison, my 11-year-old heart insisted, but a world made of polished surfaces I had no right to touch. Liu Jianhong walked those halls like a winter wind, precise, distant. He spoke to me once, standing by a window that framed the city's restless hum. You broke something of mine, he said, voice flat. You're the one whose name was on the paper. I answered with the defiance of a child who had nothing left to lose. He looked at the pendant in my palm, the Liu crest, bent where my mother's fingers had clutched it. For a moment his eyes were the only warm thing in the room. Then we have something to fix. Fixing was not a gesture, it was a siege. Xiao Wen's accusations spread like a stain. Doctored charts, disappeared treatment logs, whispers that my mother's collapse had been an act, that our lives were convenient lies. The hospital denied records until Liu threatened to cleave the board in half. He hired lawyers who smelled of leather and late nights, and he spent them like a man paying for something he could never buy back, trust. Shen Lian, fragile and small on the hospital bed, watched the battle through curtains of sleep. When she woke and saw the pendant return to her throat, her fingers trembled. "Who are you to us?" she asked him quietly. "A man who should have known better," Liu said, and the words cut deeper than any accusation. Between court filings and the hush of investigators, he taught me how to walk without slipping on marble, how to hold a cup without turning it into work, how to answer the press with nothing but a look. He was still cold, but there were nights when he stayed until the fluorescent lights went soft and read old records by hand, his fingers stained with ink and guilty history. People called him the demon CEO in headlines, but behind closed doors he argued with men who valued profit over truth until they crumbled.